Okay. Hello, everyone, on YouTube as well as on Zoom to just ask Miroslav Volf anything event, I guess. And there he is. He's very excited to answer everything. I should say, Professor, that we shared it on a Facebook group, and we said, ask Miroslav Volf anything. And then one theological student said, but am I going to understand his answer? That is the big question.
Well, we'll work hard on that.
No. So, guys, in terms of the ground rules for tonight, it's tonight here in South Africa, and it is the center of the world. So I'm just going to use South Africa as the frame of reference. Good afternoon to the people in the States or wherever you're joining from. What I'm going to do is this thing was born out of a book club or two book clubs, I should say, and I just want to give preference to the questions of those who attended it, and these guys sent their questions to me. So if the rest of you guys would just excuse me if I pay more attention to those questions that I'm going to read to Professor Volf, and then if there's time, I hope there will be, we can open up for more questions. We can see how it goes. I just know that it can be a little bit annoying if most of the Zoom interview starts with, can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me? Which is a little bit annoying. So it might be better if we can just use the chat box in Zoom as well as on YouTube to ask questions. Then we can, we'll be able to filter them out and ask them. Hopefully we'll get there. Chances are that we're not going to get to everybody's question. So that is the one thing that I just quickly wanted to mention. Professor Volf, I'm not going to introduce you because anybody who's here, I'm pretty sure has a good idea of who you are and what you've written and why they are interested in you. But let me just start off by saying thank you so much for joining us, for answering a random email from South Africa, and for agreeing to Zoom with us. We are most grateful.
I'm very thankful for you for organizing this. I'm eager to hear what you have to say and what you have to ask.
Yeah. So, Professor Volf, the questions that we're looking for.
Can we go with Miroslav?
Oh, sure, Miroslav.
Excellent.
So you can call me Mr. Johan. No,
Mr.
So, Miroslav, if we, what I want to tell you is that we are mostly lay people. Some of us are intellectuals. That definitely does not include me, but we are mostly people trying to figure out how to do reconciliation in a place like South Africa where it's desperately needed. And we are not necessarily interested in ivory tower type of discussions. And we also want to give you the freedom to not feel like you have to be very careful as a theologian and as a thinker, but you can really speak from the heart as well. I think we can have that kind of grace in as much as you're an academic and you want to scrutinize Miroslav, then I don't think this is the place. We are practitioners here trying to make sense of how to follow Jesus in a divided culture globally and here in South Africa. So, Professor Volf, the first question I want to ask comes from Torsten. He's here with his wife on Zoom as well. And he says that a repeated idea in your book is that one needs to go the embrace route. But what in all the world would make anyone want to move from exclusion to embrace? What hope is there for embrace to win the day? In the battle between open arms and clenched fists, the fists are yet to lose. The book was written in response to devastating exclusion and describes what should have happened but didn't. Could you give us some subsequent positive examples, small or large, of where people chose the embrace option?
That's a great question, it's not the first time that I'm asked this question, and I think I remember very specifically when I was asked it first time, and it was after the book was translated into my own home mother tongue, Croatian. I was at a book launch, and I talked about exclusion and embrace, and then I talked, as I do much in the book, about the will to embrace. And I saw in the back a gentleman who was standing and who was kind of restless. And I knew at the end of the lectures, he didn't ask any questions during the question Q&A session, but I was certain that at the end he's going to come and talk to me. And that indeed is what happened. When everybody else cleared, he came to me and he said this, "But how do I do it?" And so I asked, "Well, how do you do what? Or how do I get it?" And I said, "How do you get what?" And he said, "How do I get the will to embrace?" And that really is most fundamental of the fundamental questions that we are faced with. How does one kind of get out of the immediacy of the situation, which for us demands reaction to action that is already prior and present and pressing very hard at us? How does one get certain kind of freedom, one? And two, how does one get the freedom to do the right thing? Namely, to act in a way that aligns with what I would describe is the story of Jesus Christ, which is the story of the very character of God. And I'm stumped as to how to answer that question. And I basically had to say, I'll make one observation, and then I'll respond to this gentleman. I said, an observation is, I'm so surprised that it happens, but I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen in families. I've seen it happen among friends. I've seen it happen in unlikely circumstances. I've seen forgiveness, which is kind of a miracle, sprout where it normally shouldn't sprout. It happens. Now, do I know how it happens? And I said, as a Christian, as a believer, I believe that every will to embrace, which sometimes takes form of forgiveness, but is more broad than that, every will to embrace is a gift, is a fruit of the spirit of embrace, that is the spirit that is active in the entire world, whether one is a Christian or is not. And I have a firm conviction that that is the case. Jesus Christ is the word that enlightens everyone, and the spirit of Jesus is the spirit that connects everyone to that word. And so my answer, how does one get it, is listen to the heart. And you might be surprised yourself. And then the question becomes more, how do I have the courage to do that? Or we can put it this way, what is it that I do to stifle the voice that tells me that that's how I ought to respond? Or what am I to do so that I can drown the voices from outside and the pressures from outside that seem to make it impossible for me to do what deep down I know that is in accord with my humanity?
Maybe a follow-up on that, which might help you answer it on a more personal level. I listened to a theologian called Alexander Santrak. I'm probably butchering his name, but he's a Serbian.
Alexander Santrak from Serbia, yeah.
From Serbia. And he did a talk here in South Africa a few years ago. And he did a talk on you, as a matter of fact, in your work. And then after the talk, he told me that he doesn't agree with you in terms of the numbers and the conflict in the Balkan. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but what it amounted to is that he would dispute and contest sort of the narrative of exactly, who are the aggressors, who are the guilty ones. And my question is, here are two theologians, and he described you at least as a friend and as a mentor, I guess, as well.
Yeah.
But you guys were very personally involved in this conflict, and you cannot agree on the numbers and the facts, but yet it seems like you guys are friends. How on earth is that possible?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and he wrote a very friendly book about me as well. Um, so I mean, the two sides to your question, right? How can you how can you be friends and disagree? And how can you be friends and actually not come to agreement, right?
I mean,
So
the question between disagreeing about, which sports team to support, but then a big disagreement about an atrocity in both your countries that's so personal. It's not trivial, so it makes it even
no.
more remarkable that there's a friendship there.
Yeah, so I think one of these things is the question of how, despite disagreement, is that one can be what can be a friend. And I think from my perspective, my sense of friendship, it's very interesting because the kind of imagination that informs my thinking, theological imagination that is guided by the metaphor of embrace, informs his own thinking. So, in terms of the goals that we pursue, we are in agreement, but we are in disagreement about how to read concrete situations. Now, this is not such an unusual situation, right? If you look at not cases of friendship, but if you look at family disputes, you might quite well be committed to one another and quite well also agreed about the goal where you're headed. But once you start figuring out with your wife what happens when this thing happened, then you suddenly realize, we have experienced it so differently, and I can kind of bracket this disagreement and pursue it further. Then there's a middle position, which I think is very interesting. Alexander and I are not on that at that spot, but it is. We can even forgive things with which we disagree. Sometimes you think, well, in order to forgive something, you need to know exactly what happened. So now I know exactly what I'm forgiving. But if that's the demand of forgiveness, I'm not going to forgive nothing, because I don't know of any person, or forgiveness would be an exception to a very prevalent rule, because disagreements of what transpired are they're ubiquitous. So what I say is also that my reading of, in order to forgive, in order to embrace, I have to hold lightly to my reading of the situation itself. Now, I don't have to cease to be committed to truth. I don't even have to cease to commit to believe what I believe. I just have to make sure that I don't think that it's an ultimate truth that could never possibly be dislodged. Which is to say that I forgive in eschatological hope. I never forgive in fullness of knowledge of what is. Every forgiveness, every reconciliation, I think, is properly an eschatological event, so that it's happening in hope. And this hope is a hope that doesn't quite know everything, that is lived in certain kind of darkness. And I think that partly explains our own possibilities of friendship, but it also explains how forgiveness can be a journey, and can be a deepening forgiveness of something that's a deepening understanding of each other, and deepening understanding of what transpired, deepening understanding of where we are actually headed. And I think it's this venture of the journey together toward embrace that is both exciting and sometimes difficult to commence. But if you don't expect too much of it, we can commence it. You can always break it off. I always tell myself, right? I can always break off if I start on this journey, but I'm better off starting on it and seeing where it happens. And that takes certain kind of courage, certain kind of hope, and sort of one moves forward. Hope that is, I think, fundamental to all human interchanges.
Thanks, Miroslav. So a question from Sekhomoto. She's also joining us tonight. She's a teacher here in South Africa. She says that it seems like your book is written for individuals, and if you look at that line that you say that you are not that interested in systems, but in what kind of selves we need to be. Yeah. But what role does community play in embracing and excluding? Maybe just to add that the language that we use of the day, it's very much not individual. It's more systems, systemic evils, systemic racism, systemic patriarchy, etc. Yeah. So is your book perhaps too individualistic? I'm also putting some words in Komoto's mouth here, but I think that's the gist of the question.
Yeah, no, that's a fair question. I think it's a very important question. Now, I personally believe in systemic forms of evil, whether that's the evils economic or evil political setups, or whether that is indeed kind of systemic types of racism, which is to say the kinds of evil patterns that have been ingrained and that are being systemically generated, so that in order to be kind of freed even of something like unconscious participation in this, we have to attend, or we have to be aware of those pressures, but also kind of take a kind of a distance from them individually, and then work toward overcoming them. But even as I've just formulated this, it seems to me clear that we cannot circumvent the individual. After the system will be changed, not because you let the system run itself to the ground. It's going to be changed if people actually worked on change of that system. But in order to work for change, you've got to have a kind of self that sees itself as shaped, but that can step outside so that it can be involved in proper transformation. Now, in this book, I'm also, I say that I'm interested in socially constructed agents. Mm-hmm. And that's where I think that actually theology can make most significant contribution. That doesn't mean that I don't think that systemic issues are important. For instance, questions of law I consider to be really important. But I think I don't know enough about law to be able to write a book about kind of international or even national constitutional, say, law, in order to figure out how laws have to be configured. I can think together with lawyers on that issue, but I myself have no specifically theological, out of my own expertise to give. So when I describe that, it's less I'm not interested in this, or this is not important, then these are my limits. And this is what I need to, can contribute. And this is what I think is also important, obviously, to contribute. So I say nothing about political reconciliation. Like my friend Dan Philpott has written a whole book about political reconciliation. He's a political scientist. And he and I might have disagreements on the dynamics of reconciliation, but nonetheless, I think, I need to learn how it is that government agents perpetrate, when government agents perpetrate evil, how does the dynamic of reconciliation follow under these kinds of conditions, which is something that is very important, but not necessarily my native expertise.
I understand. So maybe I think this question adds to that one. You don't have to elaborate if you think you've already answered most of it. But Louise, who's a philosopher who also joined the book club, she said that she supports the notion of embrace in the private sphere. But wouldn't it be better to subscribe to Hannah Arendt's model of politics as an impersonal force in the public sphere for a greater chance at peace? Isn't the will to embrace perhaps too sentimental when it is applied to structures rather than the private sphere?
Yeah, I think it primarily is located. I think, by the way, forgiveness too is, in my estimation, primarily located at an interpersonal and kind of relatively small scale communal levels, rather than the larger political, very impersonal levels. I would agree with that, and I would say maybe something like Embrace has analogs. That's what I would argue. Something kind of analogous processes as like Embrace, both in terms of processes and in terms of aims, have to occur at the political level. Whether it's useful to call that Embrace, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that necessarily would be persuasive to everyone, and I don't think that it may not be misleading. In fact, so yeah, I'm basically not disagreeing. Yeah.
Good. Miroslav, two questions from Itai Chitapi, who's joining us here. He's a Zimbabwean South African living in Canada, which is another way of saying he's confused. But he says he is deeply frustrated by the global situation, though mainly in the West. Is there something I can say? Is there a way I can hold myself? What sort of agent should I be in the presence of the new cultural rulers on the political left, who with no sense of irony demand conformity of thought and attitudes in the name of freedom for all? That's his question. I want to read Trevor and Tlola's question as well, because I think Trevor and Tlola is maybe touching on this as well. Then you can respond to them in tandem. He says that he feels like the evangelical church is getting poorer in her spirituality at the expense of being politically correct and her political activism. It is as if the centrality of Jesus has at times been obfuscated by buzzwords like justice and intersectionality and othering. Is it possible that we are following the spirit of the age and not Jesus?
It is possible. That's always a possibility, and always a certain likelihood, I would say. So we live in a highly polarized political situation. And in highly polarized political situations, a certain kind of orthodoxies are almost instinctively reinforced, so that any form of deviation from the party line ends up feeling like a betrayal. I have experienced this in former Yugoslavia during the war. You could not locate yourself somewhere in the middle and criticize both sides somehow from some independent vantage point. The pressure was always to align, because people felt that if you didn't, you're actually betraying their cause, you're not helping. Now, I've never found myself capable of doing that, actually. And that's why I never find myself at ease in a relatively firmly established, polarized positions. And I find that Christian allegiance ought to be fundamentally to Jesus Christ. And wherever it falls on the spectrum, that's where it's going to fall. I want to distinguish, as I say that, I want to distinguish, though, between the substantive positions, and I think that's true when it regards to substantive positions. Where it falls, it's going to fall, this faithfulness. But I also want to apply it to the procedures that we use in order to negotiate those positions. And I think that that's partly what I hear in this question. It's not just that we differ in substantive positions, but it's that a certain kind of discourse between the groups is practiced. And I think that from my standpoint, the condition of possibility of discourse in pluralistic settings, moral character of the conditions of possibility of discourse in pluralistic settings is almost as important issue as the substantive issues that are being discussed. And we need to distinguish these two. And often we think Christianly, want to think Christianly on the substance, but we don't want to, or we're not capable, not interested in thinking Christianly on the conditions of discussion about those substantive issues. I think those conditions of discussions are also substantive goods for Christians, and therefore ought to be shaped by fundamental Christian commitments. Now, that will have as implication, as I've tried to argue in Exclusion and Embrace, something like a double vision, right? I'd have to always, at least imaginatively, assume that I'm not right, that I could be not right, place myself in the position of other persons, see their positions from their perspective, my positions from their perspective, and then continue in the process of making judgments, political or other kinds of judgments. We may disagree still, and we may disagree also strenuously, but at least we're going to disagree in the ways in which honor and respect the other person, the other position, and at least the way in which we conduct interchange will not preclude the future disagreement. Just think of, some of you might have seen yesterday's debate between our two illustrious candidates. God help us, right? This is precisely complete, whatever substantive positions are, complete breakdown. And frankly, I would say from one side rather than from another. And maybe Biden got himself too much, allow himself too much to be drawn in this. But that's a very important issue. So hard encrusted positions that demand conformity, I want to resist them, and I want to resist the types of discourse between these kinds of hard encrusted positions. And frankly, some of you have seen some of my tweets, and for some they're uncomfortable. But for me, the little tagline that I have, before I tweet, I pray, "Oh, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace." And I do, actually, and take that very, very seriously as a mode of discourse, but because that seems to me fundamental.
Maybe, I mean, you touched on it now. A friend of us, Mashlatse Mashua, he asked a question. Well, it's not a very good question. He's more rambling, but he says, you recently had a tweet where you quoted Nietzsche on about a national God, and in particular, what is your analysis of American nationalist Christianity? So, yeah, I'm not sure if there's a question there.
Well, yeah, no. I think that there could be there. I definitely see a question there. Yes. Basically, what my most recent tweet is I picked this from Nietzsche. This idea that if you want to have national gods, get ready to have a bloodthirsty gods. Get ready to get your gods dirty their hands and bloody their hands according to the kind of dictates of particular national entities of which they are gods. You can't have then God for everyone. You can't have a God loving your enemy and so forth. And that I think is a correct observation. And Nietzsche makes this as an observation against what he derides as cosmopolitan Christian God. I take his observation to be in favor precisely of such God, and as a critique of nationalism, Christian nationalism in particular, because it would seem to me that, two things about nationalism. One, I think nations are fairly artificial constructs. They may be tied to languages, but even as such, they're artificial. If I think of Croatian language and how it was shaped, national idea had a profoundly significant role to reduce, I don't know how many dialects that were rooted in a small communities, all dispersed so that we can have a national language, and that can be a unity. That's an artificial construct. Nobody spoke that language. it was imposed on us in school systems. So nations, in other ways, we can think of nations as just such imagined communities and artificially, therefore, imposed communities. I totally disagree with people like Christians like John Paul II was known for that, with his kind of a Polish nationalism, so that one can be only a self when one belongs really to nation. I disagree with that. I find nations too nebulous and too imagined, too insignificant for that. Nonetheless, there are realities, and as realities, and important realities now, and as realities that sometimes decide about life and death. In many cases, they do, whether that send you to war or in the cases or judicial system to decide your whole destiny, right? I think they need to be, the allegiance to nation needs to be placed under the allegiance of Jesus to Jesus Christ. I think that's true. Jesus says, "Oh, even of families," and we know what the crazy consequences are of that happening. Abraham goes on the Mount Moriah to sacrifice his son because he gives greater allegiance to God than he does to his immediate family or to the entirety of progeny that will come from him and will bless all nations in his imagination, or as God promised him. So I don't see how one can think that somehow United States is particularly chosen from God to be beacon in the world of darkness outside, especially knowing that United States has started more aggressive wars than just about any country on the planet. So though I'm not an unhappy citizen of this country, I think it deserves a critique. And any nation, I could list similar things about my own nation, other nations. It's always easy to throw stones on others. Look at our own nation, and suddenly it doesn't look quite as pretty as we wanted it to look, or as, again, our president, Mr. Trump, insists that it ought to look.
Well, if they export you because of this comment, you are most welcome in South Africa, Miroslav.
Thank you.
So maybe this adds to this previous question. So in the preface to your latest edition, you talk about when you wrote Exclusion and Embrace in the 90s, you could assume a common humanity, but that is something that you can no longer assume, both from people politically on the left and on the right. And there's a linguist, John McWhorter, and I read an article recently where he said that it's as if usually the identity politics of old functioned on a common humanity type of principle. And he suggests, he's not a Christian, but he suggests it's because it was rooted in the church, because the abolitionist movement was sort of led by the Frederick Douglasses of the world, civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, and even the apartheid movement here in South Africa had very strong common humanity language. But now it seems like common humanity is just a power play. It's a word that people, a set of words that people are very suspicious of. Mm-hmm. What do you make of it? Do you think that perhaps the reason why we've lost the common humanity is we've moved the conversation away from the church? Is that overstating it?
Yeah. So in this preface to the book, I engage one of the French philosophers of the New Right, de Benoit, and his argument is that it is a kind of monotheist invention, that any kind of pre-monotheist, non-monotheists accounts cannot quite explain common idea of common humanity. Maybe that's true. Maybe it isn't. I'm not quite certain. My own colleague here, Christakis, he argues in Blueprint that he can do so on kind of natural grounds. I'm not entirely persuaded, but whichever it is, I think Yeah, we are in a, I want to say, belief in one God, the creator, implies the commonality of our humanity. And implies, I think, a dignity of each person, irrespective of any moral, cultural, or any other kinds of achievement that that person has. Just by fact of our being born of a human, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer used to say, we are human. And as such, we have inherent dignity. Now, and from there, I think certain key moral convictions follow. I think the difficulty with common humanity on number of fronts and left and right today is that has been associated with European modernity. So sort of European modernity stabilized and carried on the wings of globalization, rooted in certain forms of economic or supported by certain forms of economic relationships, become a vision of what human is, kind of a sovereign individual who stands in external relationships with others and who has to confirm, construct their own identity in the process of exchanges in a competitive environment. That's kind of a roughly the modern version of who human being is. Now, if you associate it as normative, quote unquote, humanity, that's normative. There's quite a bit of inhumanity has been not just normalized but normativized in this vision of a human being. So I think there is a contestation to be had about what and who and how do we construe universal normative humanity. But I don't think as Christians can see the way to go beyond kind of the normative humanity, which allows me then to think of human beings also as very much plastic, very much different, very much in different settings, in different circumstances, with different mores, different customs, and so forth. So this common humanity isn't denial of this incredibly rich plurality that humanity is, but actually a condition of possibility of its thriving together with others. And I think one more thing I should say, I think that the future, that none of us can be saved alone. All of us are saved when we are saved together with the others. Our planet cannot be saved in a little niche. It has to be saved as a whole. And that too is connected with the singleness of God and relation of everything to God for its flourishing.
Okay. Miroslav, a question from Tubi. He says that he realizes that you're a theologian and you're probably going to be careful and you're an outsider and you're probably not going to want to be imperialistic. But nonetheless, he asks
Thank you. You assume relatively right.
But what do you think white South Africans in 2020 need to hear, and what do Black South Africans in 2020 need to hear? And he puts on this preface. He says, in other words, how do the children and grandchildren of perpetrators and victims, how should they relate?
Yeah.
Good luck.
Yeah, no, this is really, I mean, I certainly cannot comment on South African situation. That would be really presumptuous of me, but I can see how a kind of grandchildren question has a layer of complication to it, especially if grandchildren question isn't just a kind of grandchildren in a situation in which past has been just generationally extended, but much has happened between the groups. That's the case. I'm thinking, for instance, of the United States, or I'm thinking about Croatia. Discrepancies in power continue to exist, continue to be reinforced, and how then we attend to now reconciliation or life together, not only as those who have a long common history and the struggle of liberation, but in a post-liberation setting, continue to be involved in a kind of struggling, tense relationship. It's beyond my pay grade. I would just want to urge us all to keep Christ at the center, both as a goal and as the modes, a mode of our, both as a goal, as a substantive goal of our, both in formulating substantive goals of our engagement and in pursuing means by which to achieve those. Means for Christian perspective are also goals. Now, I know this is very abstract, and it can be evasive, but and maybe it is. But on the other hand, I find that the gospel, and the gospel for me is Christ, has to be improvised in particular situations. There's no correlation from one who is the same yesterday, today, and forever, an immediacy of situation that's everywhere. So the sameness of Christ forever doesn't mean the sameness of Christ in the form of embrace we make of Christ. Because in the form we make embrace of Christ is shaped by the difference in situations in which we find ourselves.
So Twibi's good friend and colleague, Sibu Sisu, he probes a little bit harder. He says, how can so-called oppressed groups embrace when the power dynamics have not changed for them? Do you think that those groups first need economic power before there can be true embracing? What factors does power and money have between different groups of Christians in different places in society?
No, yeah, that's also an excellent question. So I consider the kind of the embrace, or even if you want to use a reconciliation process, I consider it actually as ongoing process. So it's I don't think I think of it as let's resolve first all the power dynamics and the distribution of goods as they ought to be, and then we can proceed to something like an embrace. I don't construe it also, let's embrace, and somehow the situation and discrepancies in economic and political power will take care of themselves, which I don't think it's going to happen. So I think that the two processes have to go simultaneously together. Now, that's the hardest, I think, for those who even now are and find themselves under the boot of the oppressive system. And I think which means that for all of us, this means that the struggle for equality and the search of embrace, struggle for justice and search for embrace, are mutually constituting rather than exclusive or sequential processes. That's part of what I've tried to argue in chapter on truth and on embrace. The will to embrace in some ways precedes the search for justice and search for truth, and the search for truth and justice leads to embrace. So you have this cycle that is going on in both directions.
This takes the conversation in a bit of a different direction. Are you still okay, Miroslav?
Yeah. No, I'm good.
So Derek asked a question. He says that God separated Israel from others. They did not colonize in a so-called positive sense, if you can use that these days in a positive sense, the promised land as such, but rather destroyed all others in the land. If you wanted to join them, they had to completely assimilate with Israel. Israel was not called to embrace others. Does your theology of embrace fit in with the Old Testament?
No. It doesn't fit. I think on some of these issues, I see a tension, strong tension, even incompatibilities between the story of Christ and story of the conquest of the Promised Land. Now, you might want to then ask, well, what do we do with this? This is part of a single Bible. And I mean, for myself, I mean, you can try to simply say, well, one applies to the political domain and the other one Christ applies to the realm of spiritual salvation. To me, that has never been a persuasive argument, precisely because in Exodus and in the first 5-6 books of the Bible, it's a matter of liberation from slavery and into the promised land that unites both religious and political dimensions. So it's not non-salvation, somehow politics that isn't salvation, but salvation is construed in those political terms. And I think that after Christ, none of us should identify with Israel. We are not successors to Israel. Israel has its own history with God. And I think some of the things that my colleague Willie Jennings wrote about this issue are really very important. This kind of supersessionism that thinks that nation states are now what Israel was in relationship to God. And so all the promises of chosenness are applied to each individual nation state. That seems to me completely mistaken at the theological level. And then at the practical, political, and moral level, it seems to me that following the teaching of Christ could never get you to the point of being able to participate in the conquest of the Promised Land, whether you see it as colonization or even worse, if you think of it as a destruction.
Okay. I think also joining us, she's a theologian here at the University of Pretoria. She says that, she asked, do we take the vulnerability of God seriously enough from a Trinitarian perspective in order to facilitate reconciliation? And what she means by that, just a bit more, she says that do we perhaps overemphasize God's omnipotence at the expense of his vulnerability as seen in Christ, where relinquishing power in an attempt to reconcile seems more possible when we are focusing on the vulnerable incarnation of Jesus. Do you get that question?
Yeah, no, I get and I agree with that question. I think we construe the power in terms of ordinary accounts of political power that we observe. In the same way, we construe the glory, for instance, in similar kinds of ways. And just to reinforce the idea of vulnerability as a form of power, a vulnerability with particular intent as a form of power, you can see it in the Gospel of John that the crucifixion of Jesus is rendered in Gospel of John as Christ's glorification. So I think this really famous interpreter of the Gospel of John, called Johann Sebastian Bach. He's not a theologian, right? He's a composer, but he's got the Passion according to Saint John. One of the most beautiful pieces of music that I know. But at the very beginning, he has a line that it says, also in your greatest humiliation, you are glorified. He's speaking to Christ. Also, in your greatest humiliation, you're glorified. God has glory that isn't simply glory in greatest humiliation, but that too is God's glory. That too is God's power. And for Christians, I think we're called to emulate not the Christ sitting on the throne, but the Christ who is washing the feet of the disciples.
Okay. So we're coming to a close. If you have questions, I'm willing to open it up a little bit. We can maybe just for the sake of order, just ask your question in the chat box, and then Miroslav can read it. There's one question from YouTube. This is a very deep theological question. Miroslav, did you play football when you were a child? If you did, who were your favorite footballers? You can decide if you want to answer that. But the same guy, I think it is a JP, he says, what will happen to seminaries in the US now that religion is declining? For what now will people have been trained for? Can human seminaries ever be truly free of European anchored rooted theology? Not sure if that made sense.
Yeah, I think it does make sense. I did play football or soccer when I was growing up. I played it fairly badly. I was more geekish kind of a guy, and it was a club culture in former Yugoslavia. They're very serious soccer players. Even now, Croatians and Serbians. The Croatian team is absolutely fantastic. But that means that kids on basics, on the gifts, were very quickly sorted out, diverted to clubs, and folks like me had absolutely zero chance. I continued to play as a kind of little amateur, but when I came to the United States, and especially came to Guildford, I was my early 40s. Then in my town, there's a kind of pickup soccer that guys about my age, maybe a little bit younger and older, were playing. So I was playing sometimes twice a week soccer, and for America, I was decent. I could play. For Croatia, everybody would all of my friends, they kind of humor me as on the pitch.
And next question.
Serious question. There is a crisis of theology, especially in the Western world. I mean, I try to address it in my own way in the book For the Life of the World. And I think the crisis that this book is predicated on the idea that the crisis of theology is that theology has increasingly come to think of itself as a science. And emulates kind of interpretative strategies of historical disciplines, which then try to, as much as possible, align themselves with kind of natural sciences, so that the kind of logic of rationality in which we participate is such, and that's deadly for theology. That's not the question we ought to be. That's a subsidiary question to the main question we ought to be asking, because you're not just the Christ is not a historical figure simply for us. Christ is that too, but he's a paradigm in secular terms. You can say he's a paradigmatic individual. He's the one who sets a new tables of values. And Christ had to be explicated and embraced in this way, if you want to see it in moral terms, if you want to see it in more richly, which is what I do want. Christ is the kind of the very divine presence in human midst, and through the Spirit is present in our lives for the purposes of making this world God's home. Now, this is very much a normative then endeavor that asks the question of how it is that we ought to live, and if theology doesn't retrieve that, if theology also thinks that, which is what I think in some, at least that's how I was analyzing it, and maybe some of you will push against this, but I see that even publicly engaged theology is really engaged only about how to properly distribute the goods that everybody agrees ought to be distributed and are not distributed in the right way. I'm very invested in proper distribution of goods. I'm invested in the kinds of goods that are to be distributed. I'm interested in the kinds of ways we work in order to produce the goods that need to be distributed, right? All of these are important issues. But I'm interested in the beauty of the soul, of the inner character, of the shape of the self. And I don't think that there is any way in which we can live a flourishing life in the world by simply changing outward circumstances. We've got to align the self with the purposes. And all of this, God's purposes, all of this in the presence of God. So I try to then argue that the certain vision of who the self is, what the world is, and what the good is at the foundation of theological endeavor. And that if we pursue that, we'd be pursuing something that relatively few people do these days. And that is absolutely essential to who we as human beings are. So that somebody else would dictate to me what a flourishing life is, or that I could simply assume that by being born, I know that, that's such a mistake and trap in which we find ourselves, and ought not to be going there. And if theology can help us to get us out of that, we're wasting theological energies, and maybe we deserve, theologians, what we're getting.
Miroslav, one more question, and then I'm just there are two other questions that's coming from our, let's say, American or Myanmar friends. But the last South African question is this one. You constantly use terms like oppressed and oppressor, victim, perpetrator, but depending on who you are, reading that, you will decide who's the perpetrator and who's the victim. Are those categories still useful in a world where everybody is convinced that they are the victims and somebody else is the perpetrator?
So I use those terms, but I also problematize them, right? Meaning that each one of us is in a different ways and not in the same situation. Both the victim and the perpetrator in many ways, and that the gospel is the gospel for the victims and for the perpetrators as well. But to me, that's as far as I would go problematizing them. In order to erase those categories, I would have to get I would have to enter something like a Nietzschean world, in which all moral constructs, all truth constructs are just that, constructs, with no objective reality. And that seems to me will take me into the world of struggle for power without ability to adjudicate between that. And I think in many ways, many people feel, even in political situation in the United States, that's where we de facto are. I want to resist that. I want to insert the claims to what is true, to what is good, into what seems like this disentanglable, is that a word? A mess that you cannot disentangle of human relationships. And that requires that we name wronged and wrongdoers, and naming wrongs and the wrongdoers and wrongs will take you to think, at least in particular situations, of victims and perpetrators. So I believe also in Judgment Day.
No, we've noticed.
Sorry?
I said we've noticed. It was well, I mean, yeah. I think it's your last chapter in your book.
Yeah, and how can you believe in Judgment Day if you don't believe in kind of? I hope that God is universalist, right? So this is not about outcomes. This is about concrete naming of what transpired in history. And that seems to me fundamental to moral texture of human life and certainly Christian life.
Maybe just double click on that last thing you said. You hope that God is universalist.
Yeah.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
I hope that everybody is going to be saved.
Yeah.
I can't be totally sure of that, but go ahead.
Excuse me. How do you reconcile that with the judgment, the eschatological judgment?
Well, you have to. So judgment is indifferent in terms of outcomes, right? So judgment is not condemnation. Result of judgment can be acquittal.
Oh, okay.
And result of judgment can be justification, not acquittal, but making of just that person who isn't just. And result of judgment can be a condemnation. And so I can believe in judgment and hope that something like justification of everyone is going to be a result of judgment. I certainly believe for myself that I will not just be weighed, and then if I somehow weigh on the good side a little bit more than on the evil side, that I'm going to be let squeeze through. I hope that I will be justified, and not just justified in the final judgment, but also transformed, so that I can be proper citizen of the world to come.
Well, come to South Africa next year and you will be justified with logical certainty. Miroslav, we're going on over an hour. I just want to read David's question. He's a guy at Asbury Seminary. I think you know David.
David, I know David, yeah. Hi, David.
David Mo or David Moo. He says, as you know, and you even included Myanmar, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, in your revised Exclusion and Embrace book, there's so much of religion identity-based conflict happening on a daily basis. It is so hard for the ethnic minority Christians to forgive the nationalist Buddhist soldiers who kill their families and friends. Would you please say something about the role of the victim's memory in forgiving their oppressors? How far they should forget the wounds caused by the oppressor in order to forgive and embrace them?
Wow, that's a long and elaborate question. And as David knows, I've written a whole book on memory, and it's titled "Remembering Rightly in a Violent World." There's the book, and there's a new edition coming out in November of this book. If they do, it's by the miracle of God's grace. How the process looks, we'd have to spend another hour, David.
Well, maybe on a different book club can be on the end of memory.
We can, I'd be happy. Thank you so much for taking the time to read the book, to study, to discuss it. This is obviously for every author that's an honor, and you honor the work that I do, and I don't take it for granted at all. There are many claimants on your time, how you should spend it, what you should read, what you should do, and that you take time to do that, I deeply appreciate. So thank you for taking it. Thank you for your questions. They're always good reminders of where things might not quite fit in terms of what I'm starting to say, or where the pain is. Whatever we end up doing later with that pain that occurs, that's an important thing to register and know. So thank you.
No, thank you, Miroslav. I also want to just tell the group here that next week, Wednesday, so today in a week, the same time, we're going to start with a 6-session discussion on exclusion and embrace. And if you're paying attention, you have to have read till the end of distance and belonging before next week, Wednesday. And you're welcome to join. It's going to be exactly the same Zoom link that you can join, and it's going to be an international community of readers wrestling through that. So if you want more information about it, you can just email me. But like I said, it's literally on the same Zoom link that we're going to meet next week, Wednesday. Before I let you go, Miroslav, I want to ask you this question. This is actually Nat Schluter who asked this question. Can you give us one takeaway thought to reflect on how to live as followers of Jesus in the world that we have been discussing today?
Well, trust Nat to ask a really pointed and hard question. I can tell you for myself what I do, and you'll figure out what the different times and different places I've given that question, the answer to that question to myself in a different way. Right now it's between this Lord, make me an instrument of your peace, and Lord, help me to seek the kind of glory that was yours when you went on the road of giving your life for the life of the world. Glory is a concept that I've thought quite a bit in recent, maybe a year or so. Especially, I've written a piece that is I won't be very long. I've written a piece that is about value, moral or human value of competition. Our whole society rests on competition. And the argument of this piece that the human value, there may be monetary value of competition that's high, maybe reputational value that's high, but human value of competition is exactly zero, maybe in the minus a little bit, which is a different way of talking about what is glorious and what kind of glory, the most splendid thing, ought we desire. And I want Christ's glory, Christ's kind of glory.
Miroslav, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Maybe, if you don't mind, can I ask you to end in a word of prayer?
Sure. Our gracious, our loving, our patient God, our God of hope, we thank you that you have called us. We thank you that we are yours. We thank you that you have set us on a journey to follow you. Keep our hearts, our eyes, our ears open so that we can see as you see, do as you do, and know ourselves that in everything we do, we are enveloped by and held by your love. In Christ's name, amen.
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 Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Okay, friends, very good to be with you, and blessings on all of your endeavors wherever you find yourselves.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Thanks, Johan.
Thank you, John.
Rafni.
Thank you so much, John.
Getting it out too.
Ciao,
Thank you,
dears.
everyone. Bye.
So David, we're seeing you next week.
Yes, Wednesday, the same time, right, John?
Yeah. Same time. And yeah, we're gonna just discuss up until the end of Distance and Belonging.